Please be seated.
Order, color. Agenda, ease.
Every year on November 11th, Canadians pause in a silent moment of remembrance for the men and women who have served and continue to serve our country in times of war, conflict, and peace.
We honor those who fought for Canada in the First World War, 1914 to 1918, the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, and the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, as well as those who have served our country in its many peacekeeping roles. More than 1,500,000 Canadians have served our country this way, and more than 110,000 have died. They give their lives and their future so that we may live in peace.
We must remember, if we do not, the sacrifice of those 110,000 Canadian lives will be meaningless. They died for us, for our homes and families and friends, for a collection of traditions they cherished and a future they believed in. They died for Canada. The meaning of their sacrifice rests in our collective national consciousness. Their monument is our continued peace, freedom, and prosperity.
Last night I had the strangest dream I ever dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed I saw a mighty
Poppies are worn as a symbol of remembrance, a reminder of the blood-red flower that still grows in the former battlefields of France and Belgium. During the terrible bloodshed of the Second Battle of Ypres in the spring of 1915, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, a doctor serving with the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps in Belgium, wrote of these flowers which lived on among the dead soldiers' graves. Although Dr. McCrae died in 1918, shortly after writing these words, his poem lives on as an enduring testament to and reminder of those who give their lives so that others may be free.
Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row.
Good morning. My name is Jeff McKay, and I'm the music teacher here at James Strath. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker. Ted Barris is an accomplished author, journalist, and broadcaster, as well as hosting stints on CBC Radio and regular contributions to the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and national periodicals. Ted has authored 16 nonfiction books, including a series on wartime Canada. Last fall, his book, Breaking the Silence, Veterans' Untold Stories from the Great War to Afghanistan, was published. Ted is a full-time professor of journalism at Centennial College in Toronto. He has also written a weekly newspaper column, also a blog, called The Barris Beat for more than 20 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Ted Barris.
I wondered if you'd just recognize that Edith Fisher, would you mind standing, Edith? And Mary Underhill were both alive and in the service during the Second World War. That was 70 years ago. 70 years ago. Edith stayed at home with her family while her husband and her brother and other relatives were overseas fighting in Europe. Mary Underhill served with the Royal Canadian Air Force. She was what's known as a Women's Division Air Force servicewoman. She was involved in assisting in the training of air crew at Rockcliffe near Ottawa. I'd also like to introduce you to Mary's husband, Ken Underhill. Would you step forward, Ken, so that everyone can see you? Ken Underhill, 70 years ago, served on corvettes crossing the North Atlantic in the Battle of the Atlantic. You've heard about submarines that attacked ships during the war. Ken and his shipmates on the corvette named Brantford protected the ships that were taking supplies across the ocean. He later served on a frigate. Thanks, Ken. Last but not least, I want to introduce you to Wilf Pound. Wilf and I have known each other for years, and his wife, Melba. Have you ever heard of D-Day? This is when Canadians and Americans and British soldiers landed in France on the 6th of June in 1944 to begin the restoration of peace and the return of the property that was the French and the Belgians and the Dutch back to their rightful owners. Wilf Pound was with the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa. On that day, he landed on that beach, and he and his comrades began the process of freeing Europe. Thanks, Wilf and Melba. When you see those faces of those ladies and gentlemen, what's the thing that strikes you most about the way they look? What do they look like? They're old. That's right. But that's what happens when you grow up and you see life and you experience, you grow older. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about when they did what they did. Serving at the Air Force, serving at home, serving on the ocean, serving on D-Day. How many of you have older brothers and sisters? You have an older brother, and his name is Stefan. Anybody else? I was talking earlier, somebody had in here had an older sister. Was it Amanda? Yeah, and you are younger brothers and sisters of Amanda. How old is Amanda? 19. How old is Stefan? 20. How about you guys? Have you got an older brother or sister? How old is your brother? 2?
16,
One's 19. What's the 19-year-old's name? Kyle. Okay. So we're going to think about Kyle, who's 19, Amanda, who's 19, and Stefan, who's 20. Are Amanda and Stefan and Kyle smart? Are they? They sort of aren't sure. They laughed. Do you think Amanda and Stefan and Kyle could make really serious, important decisions? Maybe, if they had to. How about decisions about life and death? Do you think they could make those decisions? That'd be pretty scary, wouldn't it? My point is, that man back there, this man over here, those women over there were like Amanda and Kyle and Stefan, 19 or 20 years old, when they made the decision to join the services and go overseas and win this war that had to be won to restore freedom. So every picture I show you, every story I tell you, don't think about the old man here, the older women there. Think about Kyle and Amanda and Stefan. Okay? Is that a deal? Okay. The first story I'm going to tell you a little bit about is this guy. His name is Charlie Fox. He looks pretty young. He was 20. When Charlie Fox saw this aircraft fly over his head in Guelph, Ontario in 1934, he saw a biplane like that. And he thought, boy, I want to get my hands on one of those. And then when the war was declared in 1939 and posters like this inviting young Canadians to join the Air Force started popping up, Charlie Fox joined the Air Force, just like Mary did. Only she wasn't flying airplanes. He wanted to fly airplanes. And there's Charlie in the back row on the right-hand side under the red X. There he is, right back on the side, and he learned how to fly. He expected, when he finished his time in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which was the plan in Canada that trained pilots, that suddenly he'd get his wings, which were the decoration on his chest, and he'd be sent to England and get into a Spitfire and a Hurricane. Who knows what a Spitfire and a Hurricane is? What is it? It's a plane, a fighter plane. And he figured the minute he got into a Spitfire or a Hurricane, he'd shoot down all those German aircraft that were causing problems in Europe. But that wasn't to be. Because Charlie, you see, trained on these biplanes, Fleet Finches, in that mud. And then he learned to fly wing aircraft, Harvards. And finally, he got his wings. You see that little decoration on his chest? That was the most important thing in his life, getting those wings. Because now he figured he'd go over to Europe, he'd get a commission, and he'd go over to Europe and he'd fight in the skies for the freedom of France and Belgium and Holland and Italy and all throughout Europe. But it wasn't to be. Because you see, Charlie was such a good flyer that he became an instructor for the next classes coming behind him. And so he spent the next 3 years in these things. They're called Harvards. They're training aircraft. And the training aircraft trained other men. Charlie couldn't get overseas yet. He trained 125 pilots so that they could go into Spitfires and Hurricanes overseas. And he had to wait for his turn. And he got his turn. And there he is with his hands leaning on the gun cannon of a Spitfire in 1944. Now, what happened to Charlie in the war when he got his chance? Charlie happened to be one of those fighter pilots who was in all the right places at all the right times. He saw some of the most significant action during the Second World War. Among other things, he flew with a man named Buzz Burling. Now, when you study Buzz Burling in your history, in Canadian history someday, you'll find out that Buzz Burling was the most decorated fighter pilot that Canada ever produced in the Second World War. Charlie flew with him. And then, like Wilf, on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, Charlie Fox was flying cover. Anybody know the name of the beach in Normandy the Canadians landed on? What was it called? Juno Beach. Good for you. Charlie was in the air flying cover to make sure that the Canadians and the Americans who were landing in Normandy could do so safely. But he had an added incentive. You know why? What's an incentive? He had to do an extra special job. He wanted to do an extra special job. You know why? Because Charlie had a younger brother named Ted, who was in the artillery. Guess what he was doing on D-Day? He was landing on the beach with Wilf. And Charlie was providing cover over top in the sky so that those men could land. 15,000 Canadians went ashore on D-Day to help win back the freedom in France. And Charlie was protecting them. Charlie also, about a month and a half later, was involved in a very interesting operation. As a fighter pilot, his job was to go up in the air and to search for targets. The Germans were very strongly entrenched all across Europe with weapons and manpower, and his job was to find those things and destroy them. He destroyed locomotives and guns and trucks, and one day on July the 17th, Charlie was up in the air. They referred to it in the Air Force as looking for targets of opportunity. And he's flying along, and he sees a car racing through the woods. It's a staff car. There's a German officer in there. And so he swoops down, as you see in that painting. He opens fire, and he quickly gets back into the clouds because he sees the car drive off the road and crash. He gets back to his base, and he hears a radio is buzzing when he lands. The radio says a New Zealander, it also says an Australian, it also says a Brit, it also says an American have shot that car off the road. Why was it important? The guy who was sitting in the back seat was a guy named Erwin Rommel. He was the highest-ranking general the Germans had in France. But Charlie kept his mouth closed. He didn't say, I did it. He let the other guys take the glory. Until many years later, his pilot's logs revealed that it was he, Charlie Fox, this man who became the honorary colonel of 412 Squadron, was responsible for driving the Desert Fox out of World War II. Think about Amanda. Think about Stefan. Think about Kyle. Do you think they could have done what he did? They would have if they'd had to. I'm going to introduce you to this lady. In this picture, she's about 18 years old. Her name is Annie Kaiser. Annie grew up in a little town just inside the Dutch border from Germany. The town was Enschede. Any Dutch people here? Your family's Dutch? Ever heard of Enschede? Just a little town. She grew up there. She was 13 years old when the Germans invaded Holland and occupied her town and threw everybody into labor forces and told them that they couldn't practice their regular schooling and learn Dutch and mathematics. They had to learn German. And their freedom was taken away. That's like taking away your favorite friend. It's like taking away your home. That's what happened to Annie. And so Annie, she tolerated it at first because she thought, this will pass, the Allies will come, eventually they will move inland and they'll free Holland. And then it became intolerance. And then it became anger. And then Annie decided to join something called the Underground. Anybody know what the Underground is or was? What did the Underground do? Anybody know what that is? It means you go underground hiding while you're trying to win the war. So her country was being occupied, and she took on duties attempting to change that. She had an interesting talent, Annie did. She was a hairdresser. I know that sounds funny in the middle of a war, but what do hairdressers do? They comb your hair. What else do they do? They dye it. That's right. They change color. You know what was happening to Annie's friends in Enschede? Her Jewish friends? They were being taken away and being put in concentration camps. And many of them were killed because they were Jewish, because they practiced a different faith, and because the people who were running the German army, Hitler and his inner circle, didn't like Jews. Many of them were killed. What Annie did was she took her skill with hairdressing and she helped her Jewish friends dye their hair blonde and their eyebrows blonde so that they didn't look like Jewish people, they looked like German people. It was a way of hiding her Jewish friends from that horrible end. She also took newspapers that the Underground was publishing, sharing information about the progress of the Allies coming to Holland, and she carried those underground. She also smuggled food. She lived in Enschede. They weren't allowed to leave the town, but once in a while, she and her mother would leave the town, and her mother would take her favorite linens. What are linens? Anybody know what a linen is? What is it? Cloth. They took their most precious cloth, tablecloths and all kinds of knitting and prep into the cloth that they had, and they would take it to the country to find farmers. And farmers would trade food for the cloth so that she could take it back for her friends and family in Enschede. One day, she and her mother are riding on bicycles. They're smuggling food under their clothing. Their bicycles have no tires. They're just riding on the rims, so it's a rough ride. And suddenly they're coming back to Enschede, and they see Germans at the gate to the town. And Annie is very scared because Germans sometimes shot Dutch people for smuggling food. And Annie stopped in front of the Germans and admitted she had food. She had butter, and she had milk, and she had some vegetables. And she showed the German that she had them. And the German laughed at her and told her to pass. And her mother was so frightened, so scared, that she wet herself and rode into the ditch and crashed. She was so frightened. Annie told me these stories. Annie was 18 when the war ended. Think of Amanda and Kyle and Stefan. And at the end of the war, when the Allies finally arrived, the tanks came in and began to liberate her town. In May of 1945, these are some of the crews, the Canadians who came in to liberate, to give them back their freedom. And Annie had the chance to ride on a Sherman tank through Enschede, leading the Canadians to where the Germans were running on the other side of town back to Germany. And she said she promised herself and everybody in town she would kiss the first liberator who came to town. Guess who that first liberator was? A Canadian. A guy from Halifax who had a Bren gun in his hands. And of course, he didn't want to have any time for kissing. He had a war to win. But that's what Annie remembers at 18. Extraordinary. Want to meet this man. Hal Marathew. from Quebec. He fought in Holland. He helped liberate Holland. But then when the Korean War broke out in 1950, he rejoined to train the platoon with whom he would serve in Korea. He was what's called an engineer, a pioneer. Anybody know what a pioneer does? What do they handle in the ground? Very dangerous. Explosives. His job in Korea was to handle those little boxes in the bottom of the picture. Their job was to set mines out in front of the Canadian position in Korea to protect the Canadian soldiers. One night in October of 1952 in Korea, they're behind the Canadian lines. After they put these mines out in front of their position, they hear explosions, and they think the enemy is coming. The Chinese and the North Koreans are coming across their part of the territory, and they've set off those mines. Then they get a radio report. No, that's not true. The reason the mines are exploding is that a Canadian patrol coming back from the darkness has accidentally tripped into the friendly mines and set them off. Would that be dangerous, do you think? Yeah, it could kill you. And in fact, it killed 2 of 6 men. But there were 4 wounded men. And who knows where those mines are placed? Hal Merrithew and his pals, including the man second from the right, Roland Pierce. Roland Pierce had a metal detector. You know what a metal detector is? It's like a plate, and you have a stick on it, and it's like it has a magnet on it, and it detects where metal is. And they thought if they're down there in the dark, maybe the metal detector will find the mines quickly and they can bring out the wounded and the dead. He turns on the metal detector, and it's constantly static. You can't tell between the shrapnel in the ground and the mines in the ground. And so Roland Pierce, another pal of his Dion, and Hal Merrithew leading them, gets down on his hands and knees in a cold October night, and with a bayonet in his bare hands, they crawl into the minefield and find the mines and defuse them, turn them off. They find the men who are wounded and bring them out alive, and they bring out the dead men too, because it was important to retrieve them. And for that effort, he received the Military Cross in Korea, one of the highest honors anyone can receive in combat. Hal Merrithew did. And when I met Hal Merrithew in 1997, and he told me the story, he broke down in tears. He was weeping. He wouldn't stop crying. And I stopped and I said, it must have been a horrific night, being in the dark with the mines and bringing out the men who were wounded and dead. And he said, yes, it was the most horrific night of my life, but that's not why I was crying, he said. I said, why? He said, because from that night when we went into that minefield until this day in 1997 when I met him, he'd never had the chance to meet up with his friends who had helped him that night, Mr. Pierce and Mr. Dion. And because he hadn't had that chance, it's called, among doctors who know what post-traumatic stress is, PTSD, you've heard of that? It's called not having the chance for closure, not having a chance to bond again with the men who'd survived a traumatic event with you. He hadn't had that chance, and he cried. Guess what? 7 days later, I found Roland Pierce, one of the 2 men, and here's a picture of them in reunion. That was the first time they'd seen each other in 50 years. Hal Merrithew in the middle, Roland Pierce on the right. Rolly died 2 years ago. Hal Merrithew died on Tuesday. But they had a chance. They had a chance to reunite. Think about Kyle, Stephen, and Amanda. Could they have done what these people did? Hard to say. You know, you don't have to be an old person to be a veteran. The man who's in the front of this picture is in Afghanistan. His name is Jeff Peck. He is the son of the man who used to be the fire chief in the town where I live, Uxbridge, Ontario. Jeff Peck led his platoon of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry in Afghanistan in 2002, at the very beginning of the war in Afghanistan. Now, he was in Afghanistan in 2002 when a very interesting and horrible thing happened. Do you remember the stories that maybe your mom and dad told you about Canadians who were accidentally bombed by Americans? It was called a friendly fire incident. This is where Americans who were flying over top of a training exercise where Jeff and his mates were bombed accidentally by the Americans. They killed 4 Canadians by accident, and Jeff was there. Here's the place where it happened. It's called Tarnak Farms. It's in the middle of the Afghanistan desert. You see the little bit of tape in there in the middle of the picture? That's where the bomb hit. That's where 4 Canadians died in Afghanistan in 2002. And Jeff Peck, the man I just showed you in all the military gear at the beginning, he was about 50 meters to the left. And when the bomb hit, Jeff Peck immediately jumped into action with his men, and they went into that area. They didn't know that it was a bomb. His job was to make sure that everybody in his platoon was safe and sound, and then they had to secure the area where their comrades had been killed and many others injured. And Jeff and I sat 2 or 3 times to talk about going through that. Can you imagine seeing your men, the men in your unit killed, others wounded, surviving that? Again, post-traumatic stress. And I asked Jeff, how did you get through it? He said, I didn't. He said, my life was a mess after that. It was very difficult. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do after that. Finally got his life back on track. He was able to have a child with a dear friend of his, and he got his life on track by going back to school. He's now a lawyer. And I asked Jeff, I said, Jeff, when did it hit you, the post-traumatic stress, worst of all? And he reminded me that it happened 5 years later, during a time when another Canadian was coming back from Afghanistan, a man named Matthew Daw, who'd been killed there. And Jeff said that it was his job to meet the Daw family, the family of the dead men. What have we seen on television? When the body comes back, it comes on the airplane. It lands in Trenton. The casket comes off the plane. It's put in a hearse. Jeff was there to help the Daw family get through the pain and the difficulty and the process of getting Matthew Daw's body off the plane, into the hearse, down the road to the Highway of Heroes, 172 kilometers from Trenton to Toronto, to the coroner's office, and the coroner would say, in Canada, this man is dead, the body is now yours to the family. And I asked Jeff what that was like, because clearly it had had an impact on him. And he said it was extraordinary. He said we would travel in the hearse, or with the hearse, in the limousines, under the bridges, and they were like this. Have you been on any of the bridges, any of you, to see this? The vigils, isn't it unbelievable? The flags, the firefighters, the other soldiers, the police, anybody and everybody waving back at the Canadian families who are grieving. And Jeff remembered this. And he was in the limousine, and he remembered that when the family saw all those people, in spite of the loss of their son, they were elated, they were happy. They even laughed. And Jeff laughed with them. And then when they passed the bridges, suddenly the quiet descended back in the car. And what happens when you're alone and you've lost a son or a father or a mother or a sister? You cry. And that's when Jeff Peck, the man I met, realized traumatically that it could be him in the casket, not Matthew Daw. And the trauma of that affected him and affects him to this day. Again, I remind you, these are the decisions of the Amandas, the Kyles, and the Stephans. Not old faces, not people who are many years on this earth, young people, like your brothers and sisters, making these decisions. That's why this week is so important. That's why the connection to you is very tangible. It's not an old ancient war. It's not service that happened like ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It's going on now. I want you to meet one more person back in this group back here. His name is Dodd. He is a serving soldier. He has just returned from Afghanistan, and he too was with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. He served in Afghanistan. He served in Bosnia. David Dodds, like your brothers and sisters, perhaps a few years older, served there, made tough decisions to be there. Fortunately, he survived. Thank you, David. So when Remembrance Day comes a couple of days from now, what are you going to think about? The soldiers? And are you going to think about old soldiers? No. You're going to think about young soldiers, just the way Wilf and Mary and Edith and Ken were when they served. It's not an old person's phenomenon, remembrance. It's for everybody. Because when you go to the cenotaph, when you have your service on Thursday in this school, think about Kyle, 19 or 20. Think about Stefan, 19 or 20, and Amanda, 19 or 20. Don't think about the old people. This is a war, and its service and its Canadian history is yours. It's just as much yours as it is theirs. Another reason to remember. Another reason for us to be here today and every year to remember, reflect, and pay tribute to the people who've worn the uniform for Canada. Thank you.
Canadian soldiers have taken on a new function over the last 50 years. They have become peacekeepers. The UN peacekeeping force was founded by a Canadian, Lester B. Pearson, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Peacekeepers are traditionally placed between hostile forces to supervise ceasefires and the withdrawal of opposing forces, and Canadian soldiers have been in the forefront of these efforts.
Canadian forces under the leadership of General Romeo Dallaire were front and center during the horrific genocide of some 800,000 Tutsis in the Afghan nation of Rwanda in 1994. Dallaire and his men set up areas of safe control in Rwanda urban areas, saving the lives of an estimated 20,000 people. And from 2002 to the present, Canadian soldiers have been stationed in Afghanistan, fighting the repressive Taliban regime, clearing landmines, and helping with the reconstruction of the country. 123 brave Canadian soldiers have died in these efforts.
We would like to welcome Edith Ward and thank her for taking part in our ceremony by laying a wreath in symbolic remembrance and appreciation for all those who have given their lives, as well as those who continue to put themselves in harm's way so that we may live in peace.
During times of war, individual acts of heroism occur frequently, yet only a few are ever recorded and receive official recognition. We recognize the willingly endured hardships and fears taken on by those who serve by remembering them. The choir will now sing Hymn to Freedom, written by Canadian Oscar Peterson, as a celebration of the freedom their sacrifices ensured for us all.
Is one of a number of bugle calls in military tradition which mark the phases of the day. Where reveille signaled the start of a soldier's day, the last post signaled its end. Last post as a bugle call was incorporated into funeral and memorial services by the military as a final farewell and symbolizes that the duty of the dead is over and that they can rest in peace. Please stand for the last post and remain standing for a moment of silence and reveille.
Legion banner, prepare to dip.
Good afternoon. I always think in the life of a nation, the most important week that we celebrate is a week of remembrance. An opportunity to reflect on those men and women who served this nation so ably in the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, through a series of peacekeeping missions and into Afghanistan today. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this afternoon David R. Edgerton, a man who about a decade ago had an idea to create a wall of honor right here in Peterborough, to make that a unique wall of honor about the history of those men and women who served so ably. I do know a number of students here at Strath have taken the opportunity to look at the names on that wall of honor, because I can tell you behind every one of those names is a unique story. A unique story of 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds who left everything behind in the defense of freedom, to serve in the trenches in World War I, to serve on land, sea, and air during World War II, into Korea, through those peacekeeping missions, and today in Afghanistan. Last Sunday, I had opportunity to be at a remembrance lunch at Branch 52 of Royal Canadian Legion. There was a presentation by Major Leanne Quinn. Leanne Quinn was a nurse practitioner serving in Afghanistan in the International Hospital. She shared with us a PowerPoint presentation that will be forever with me. It's about Mrs. Bolger here today, whose son Nick made the supreme sacrifice in order that the people of Afghanistan would have a better future. But it's not only in Afghanistan today about eradicating the Taliban, it's about building hope. It's about building hope for these students, 9, 10, 11-year-old, because Canada there is building schools, building better health care, and providing those services that you and I take for granted each and every day of our lives. We can't say thank you enough to those individuals who are over there serving us today. So on Thursday, take the opportunity to visit the cenotaph in Peterborough, because it's one of the most unique cenotaphs in our nation. There are two angels there, the angel of light and the angel of darkness. And I can tell you today that the angel of light always prevails over the angel of darkness. Thank you so much, and God bless you all.
Good morning, bonjour. It's an honor to be here today on behalf of my honorable colleagues, Jean-Pierre Blackburn, the Minister of Veterans Affairs, and the Honorable Peter MacKay, the Minister of National Defence. It's a particular honor knowing that this ceremony will be made available on the internet to Canadian Forces members serving in Afghanistan this very moment. We are so very, very proud of them. Thanks to the dedication and efforts of parents, such as Mr. Christopher Potter, teachers and staff from James Strath Public School, and as a direct result of Veterans Affairs' challenge of how will you remember, we are gathering here today for this wonderful ceremony. The choirs, the school band, the guests of honor truly show that the idea of remembrance is alive and well here at James Strath and here in our community in Peterborough. Canadians recognize the commitment made by military members and their families. The men and women who have served our country have given selflessly for our freedom. Through their achievements, their bravery, and their courage, they have shaped the future of our country, and their service is a point of national pride for each and every one of us. They have also shaped the history and the future of people throughout the world, ensuring them a better future, just like our men and women in uniform are doing today in Afghanistan. While we pause to reflect on the achievements and sacrifices of our veterans, we must also realize the terrors of war that these men and women have seen and felt. Some have came back home suffering, both psychologically and physically. Our government is there to support them if and when they need it. We owe these brave men and women, the ones who are watching now, an enormous debt of gratitude. Whether they went in harm's way to overcome the evils of tyranny or terrorism, or to contribute to the collective security of a people as mandated by the United Nations, Canada's veterans and military men and women have served with passionate dedication and indeed magnificent courage. During the First World War, a young nation saw more than 650,000 of their finest citizens take up arms in our name. Only a mere 2 decades after the Great War, Canadians were called upon to offer up their lives in a fight against tyranny in a Second World War. Just a few years later, we answered the call to Korea, and our Canadian Forces members have kept up this tradition of service by maintaining peace efforts the world over for more than half a century. Today, we continually welcome home our returning troops from Afghanistan and other areas of conflict, where some have experienced more adversity in a few tours than many of us will ever experience in our lives. Today, we demonstrate in a very real way our support and recognition in memory of those who have lost their lives or bear the scars of war. We pledge to them, we pledge to Canada to never forget. To your families and loved ones, we, the inheritors of your courage and determination, promise to honor your sacrifices. We will admire the place you hold in our nation's history, past and present. This Veterans Week, Canadians all across the nation are making remembrance more than something we feel. Joining with our countrymen in Afghanistan, we are making it something we do. It's nice to see so many youth present here today. I know you're very familiar with social media like Facebook and YouTube. So what can you do? What can the young people do to remember? Take a moment to create a mashup. Share it on the Veterans Affairs Canada YouTube channel and Veterans Week Remembrance feed. These various modes of communication have unleashed a whole new creative way for Canadians to remember. It's simply wonderful to see the links created across generations, between military members and civilians, between countries. Just look at us today, using the web to share our ideas of remembrance with those so far away. Please know that Canada's young people will make every effort to ensure that the sacrifices and achievements of all those who have served our country will stay alive forever. This is our history, and we have a responsibility to remember. The students here at James Strath answered the Veterans Week Challenge. They worked hard to show everyone in their school and indeed their community, as well as Canadian forces in Afghanistan, just how they will remember. They combine the traditional with the cutting edge, and together they have made remembrance their own. And they say to all our forces of the past and our forces of the present, we will remember you. Thank you very much. It's now my honor to introduce Stephen Little, the Area Director for Veterans Affairs Canada.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor for me to be here this afternoon at James Strath Public School on behalf of Veterans Affairs Canada. Today's ceremony is an important time for all of us. We have a unique opportunity to pay tribute to our veterans. Whether it was in the First or Second World Wars, or the Korean conflict, or in the many peacekeeping missions, or even now in our current missions in Afghanistan and other areas of conflict. Our history is marked with the invaluable contribution of all of those who have served our country. During this ceremony, we remember the men and women who gave their lives for freedom, democracy, the protection of human rights, and peace throughout the world. It is to those men and women that we are paying tribute, and it is to them that we turn our thoughts. Veterans Week provides us with the opportunity to come together and to consider what it means to remember. Remembering honors the work of those who gave their lives, and it honors those who work towards changing our world to create a better future for all of us. On behalf of Veterans Affairs Canada, I am proud to honor the courage of our veterans who have served and the many Canadian Forces men and women who continue to serve our country today. I'm also proud to reaffirm Veterans Affairs Canada to our commitment to giving them the help that they need. These Canadians are a source of inspiration for our entire nation, and having all of you here today reflects this recognition. Thank you, lest we forget.